Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first entry in our series, Accounts from the Abyss. I am the curator, and I hope you enjoy. A Blight in the Valley. I swear by the graves of my kin, I saw it. The tavern fell silent for only a heartbeat, before laughter erupted amongst the patrons. A few of the men slapped their knees, their mugs knocking against the table, and sloshing ale down their sleeves. You saw what, Jory? One of them jeered, with a wide grin. Another ghost in the fog? Or was it old Marvin's scarecrow again? I saw it. The young man insisted, his voice trembling, not with weakness, but conviction. It was out past the hunting trail above the creek bed, near where the trees start to go black. It moved wrong, like its bones were turning under its skin. And the stench. His voice faltered, as if the memory itself carried the smell back with him. Rot, but fresh. They laughed again, but it sounded more hollow, as if their disbelief was gradually fading. I recognized that sound. Denial often wears the same mask as certainty. I remembered that moment clearly, the look on his face. It wasn't the frantic fear of a boy chasing tails, but a more quiet terror, both parts of shame and desperation woven together. He wanted to be believed, and yet part of him already knew he wouldn't be. Normally, I wouldn't have given such a tale any weight. The tavern is a place for boasting and drinking, not truth. Men came to forget what they saw, or to make what they saw sound grander than it was. But I had come to this town for a reason of my own, and when he spoke of the black trees and the smell of rot, I felt something in my gut turn cold. You see, I have seen it too, near enough that its shape has haunted me every night since. There is danger here, festering under the soil and skin of this place, but if I speak too plainly, they would undoubtedly ridicule me in a similar fashion. So I kept my silence. I listened, and I watched. I had to wait for whatever it was that crawled from the forest to make itself known again. I did not come to this town for its comfort, nor its company. I came because the records spoke of it, an unremarkable settlement pressed between forest and mountain, where the old names still hold weight, and the maps end in smudges. There were references in the archives I once tended, small notes buried between centuries, each one hinting at a presence that had outlived the men who feared it. The council would have called my interest obsession, though they used softer words when they dismissed me. They said pursuit of such things leads a man astray. That evil, once sought, does not need invitation to find you. I believed that superstition then. I don't more. After my dismissal and the quiet disgrace that shadowed it, I found a new kind of freedom. There was no more oversight and no more doctrine to answer to. The farther I wandered from their reach, the closer I felt to the truth that they had forbidden me to touch. When I arrived, the town seemed almost too ordinary. Smoke curled from chimneys, a smith worked at his anvil, and the tavern's door sagged from years of habit rather than neglect. Yet beneath the normalcy, something felt suspended. A few of the villagers carried a washed out pallor, their eyes dulled in a way that suggested a quiet, lingering ailment had taken a hold of the town long before I arrived. Their conversations halted when I entered. Eyes lingered longer than courtesy allowed. It wasn't hostility, it was fear, lightly veiled to appear calm. And that night, I heard it for the first time. Faint, distant, and low. A resonance that settled in the chest more than the ear, as though the ground itself were remembering something it wished it hadn't. The nights here appear to fall quickly. The sun doesn't set so much as vanish, swallowed whole by the ridge, leaving the valley steeped in a colorless dusk. By the time the last light touches the rooftops, the air has already cooled, and a fine mist gathers between the fields and the trees. The villagers say little about it, but I notice how they move faster once the shadows lengthen. How doors close with a kind of rhythm, as if guided by instinct rather than conscious thought. I try to convince myself it's nothing unusual, only the isolation, the mountains, the narrowness of the valley amplifying the dark. But the quiet here feels different. It isn't peace, it's pressure, the kind that settles on the skin and lingers in the lungs. At times, when the wind dies, I swear I can hear a faint sound from the forest. Not movement, exactly, more like the faint shudder of air being displaced by something unseen. I tell myself it's the trees, the ground shifting with cold. Still, every night, the thought repeats. Something else is awake when this town sleeps. It was on the third morning when the first sign appeared. Word spread quickly through the streets. A farmer had found something by the lower fields, near where the stream bends towards the tree line. I followed the others, but made sure to keep in the back of the crowd. There was a carcass half buried in the soft soil. A goat, or what was left of one. The shape was wrong, stretched, and slack where the body had been emptied. The ribs gaped wide, the flesh stripped in rough, uneven chunks, as though something enormous had fed in a frenzy. The head was twisted backward, the jaw torn loose. One foreleg was missing entirely. The others bent at angles that suggested neither struggle nor mercy. It was not clean work, only hunger made visible. What unsettled me was not the violence itself, but the appetite that had driven it. There was no pattern to the wounds, no purpose, only the disorder of feeding. Even the crows seemed to know it, keeping their distance in a still, uneasy ring. For a moment, I thought I saw movement beyond the trees. Not motion, but a tremor, as though the shadows had adjusted themselves. I waited for reasoning to return, for the eye to correct itself, but the unease stayed with me. In another life, I would have immediately catalogued the scene, measured the depth of the wounds, noted the angle of the ribs, reduced it to paper and ink. Yet as I stood there, the impulse faltered. The air felt too still, too aware, as though something unseen was watching. On a bramble just beyond the carcass, I noticed what the others missed: a strip of pale, translucent skin snagged on the thorns, and beside it, a decayed feather matted with drying blood. Whatever had done this was not finished, only gone elsewhere. By morning, fear had become familiar, not gone, but catalogued, something I could turn over in my mind without trembling. Reason is my armor, and I wore it willingly. I returned to the field where the carcass was found, taking notes on what daylight revealed. The earth bore gouges in erratic lines, as though something nimble and light had surged forward in a wild frenzy. Whatever panic had taken me the night before seemed indulgent now, replaced by the steady rhythm of inquiry. If the thing existed, and I could no longer deny that possibility, then it could be studied. And if it could be studied, it could be understood. I spent most of that day walking the village road, speaking where I could. The people were cordial enough, but wary. Some claimed to know nothing. Others only shook their heads, saying it was old talk, not worth stirring up again. A few muttered names for it: the Black Maw, the Thing in the Ridge, spoken in hushed tones, as though the woods themselves might whisper the name back to them. It wasn't until dusk that someone gave me more than a dismissal. An older man, bent from years of field work, was mending a fence by the far edge of town. I greeted him, offered my name, and explained my purpose. He listened without turning, hands still moving slow and sure along the wire. When I spoke of the carcass, he stopped and looked up, the set of his jaw hardening. "You best leave that be," he said. His voice was dry, rough as gravel. "Ain't nothing good comes from asking after it." I asked him if he'd seen it himself. He shook his head. "Not rightly, no. Don't need to. You can tell when it's been near. Cattle won't settle. Dogs go quiet. Even the wind don't move right. It ain't clever, whatever it is. Don't hunt. Just feeds. Don't matter what, so long as it's got breath. My family's spoken of it longer than I've been alive," he said. "In old tales, just from what gets whispered when someone goes missing. My father used the name Blight, though he never claimed to know why. Said his father called it before him. He never really knew the reason, only that the name was older than the town itself." He exhaled sharply, almost a whisper. "Most folks here, well, they'd sooner pretend it's just tales to scare children. Helps 'em sleep, thinking it ain't real. Ignorance keeps the fear from settling too deep." When I pressed him further, he turned toward me fully. His eyes were pale and clear, the kind that had seen too much sun and too little sleep. "You keep after it," he said, voice lowering. "It'll come to you. Always does. For the ones that go looking. That's how it feeds. Don't chase. Just waits for you to do the walking." He shifted his weight, eyes flicking toward the tree line. "Had a boy here once. Son of one of the mill hands. Thought he'd prove himself brave or clever. Slipped out past the gates after dark. Said he'd bring back proof for all to see. We found his lantern 2 days later. Still burning. Half sunk in the mud. Never found the boy. Not a sound. Not a scrap. Just the light. Waiting there." There was no superstition in the way he said it. No theatrics. Only a simple, lived certainty. I thanked him, though he didn't answer, and went back down the road before the light failed. That night, I recorded his words, marking each phrase with as much care as I could manage. The facts were scattered and incomplete, but something threaded through them all. A silence that seemed to move on its own. Kind of recognition. By the time I set my pen down, I already knew I would go back out. Not for proof, but to understand. And though I told myself it was reason that drove me, I could not shake the thought that reason itself might be what that thing waited for. Patient, unseen, and listening. I prepared to set out early the next morning. The sky was a dull pewter, the air sharp, with the kind of cold that numbs the nerves and dampens one's sense of distance. I packed only what was necessary: paper, ink, rations, rope, a lantern, and my hatchet for cutting wood. I told myself it was an expedition, nothing more, a collection of data meant to bring light to the truth. But even as I moved through the motions, there was a heaviness in me, an awareness of what it meant to go seeking what the townspeople had vehemently avoided. The old man's words had rooted in my thoughts, replaying as I packed. It always comes looking for the ones that go looking. I told myself He'd meant it as folklore, stories that parents tell their children, a caution to keep them from wandering too far past dusk. But the way he said it didn't carry the weight of a warning. It carried an unwavering certainty, spoken without embellishment. Still, I could not bring myself to turn away. There has to be an explanation behind these occurrences, a shape behind the whispers, and if I did not go, no one else would. Logic, that old ally of mine, told me the truth lay waiting somewhere beyond those trees. Yet beneath that logic moved something more quiet and far less noble. An ache, a compulsion, as though the force itself had drawn a thin, invisible thread through my chest, was gently pulling. By the time I left the village, the fear had already taken shape. Not panic, not quite. Something colder. I felt it settle beneath my ribs, steady and aware. I decided the best place to begin was where the farmer's silence had pointed me. His gestures, the way his eyes fixed on the dark edge of the wood, had been enough to tell me where to go, or the blackened edge of the forest beyond the village. I lingered there longer than I care to admit, staring at the line where the last of the cottages gave way to the trees. The air was colder there, as if the forest drew the warmth out of everything that neared it. The wind carried a faint, unfamiliar scent, something dry and metallic beneath the damp rot of leaves. It turned my stomach, and for a moment, I thought of turning back. Warmth, to the hum of life, to the familiar. But the stillness of the forest held me. It wasn't silence. Not truly. Beneath it, I thought I could hear something faint. The distant laughter of a child, thin and off key. It wasn't a call. Not quite. More like a beckoning for me to come closer. So I went on. The road thinned as I went, giving way to animal trails and frost-bitten brush. Each step past the tree line was a quiet acknowledgement that I might not be coming back. The first day carried a false calm. The forest seemed ordinary at first. Damp earth, soft wind moving through the birches, the distant tap of water dripping from the canopy. I followed what might have been a trail, though it was faint. The soil pressed in places where something heavy had passed. Each depression filled with rainwater that reflected the pale sky. The first day carried a false calm. The forest seemed ordinary at first. Damp earth, soft wind moving through the birches, the distant tap of water dripping from the canopy. I followed what might have been a trail, though it was faint. The soil pressed in places where something heavy had passed, each depression filled with rainwater that reflected the pale sky. Beneath the scent of moss and pine, there lingered a strange sweetness, metallic, like wet iron. By midday, the terrain grew uneven. The ground began to rise and swell with rootwork, and I noticed claw marks scored into the trunks of smaller trees. Not the sharp, narrow kind left by climbing animals, but wide gouges, deliberate and deep. I noted them down and kept walking, but they did leave me wondering. The cuts were too erratic, too deep, to be the work of any blade I knew. When dusk came, I built a small shelter of branches and canvas beside a dry creek bed. The cold settled quickly. I remember the sound of the forest thinning, fewer insects, fewer birds, until the only rhythm left was the soft creak of the trees in the wind. The second day felt heavier. The forest grew darker as I moved north, the canopy thick enough to swallow most of the light. The air had a wet iron taste, and there was a faint hum beneath the silence, like something alive beneath the soil. By late afternoon, I found the first real evidence: a pit in the ground, circular and wide, its edges softened by moss. Around it grew a cluster of pale fungi, slick and luminous in the dim light. The smell there was strong, decay mixed with earth, and something sharp, almost chemical. I saw no bones, no movement, but the soil was disturbed, still loose, as if something had recently clawed its way through. I set up camp a little farther uphill that night, where the trees bent inward. The ground was uneven, but dry enough to hold a small fire. I gathered what wood I could find and built it low, just enough to keep the cold at bay. The forest felt tranquil, and for a time, I let the quiet take me. I became lost in the solitude, watching the embers stir and dance as my thoughts began to drift. However, my peace was short lived. As the crackling flames started to dim, a sound rose from beyond the trees, faint at first, then clearer. It was a voice, though not quite human. The tone and cadence sounded mechanical, as if whatever spoke lacked familiarity. It echoed once, faltered, and then fell into a low, rasping whine that made the air feel smaller around me. For a moment, I sat still, convinced it must have been the wind running through the pines, or some trick of distance that bent sound into shape. Yet the air was still, and the forest held too much silence for comfort. I listened for a while, waiting for it to come again. Nothing. Only the faint crackle of cooling embers and the steady pulse of my own heartbeat. I forced myself to lie down, though I kept the fire smoldering low. A habit of practicality more than fear, I told myself. The cold pressed close, and every whisper of the woods seemed to lean inward, listening. Sleep came fitfully, shallow and thin, haunted by the thought that that sound hadn't been carried to me by the wind, but drawn from somewhere very near. By the third day, the wildlife had nearly vanished. No birds, no insects, only the whisper of my boots through the frost-bitten underbrush. The air had turned colder, and the ground crunched with a thin layer of ice. Through the fog, I saw a shimmer of movement, a narrow stream winding between the roots, its surface glazed in frost. I followed it until it widened into a river, slow and gray under the fog. On the far bank, the trees loomed taller, their shadows drawn long fog. The smell deepened, metallic, sour, and heavy enough to taste. Crossing took longer than expected. The water reached only to my knees, but the cold was deep and heavy, and the silt stirred in thick, reluctant swirls. The farther I went, the more the current seemed to press back, as if resisting me. Once, I thought I heard something break the surface behind me, a faint, wet sound, gone as soon as I turned. When I reached the opposite side, the forest waited in silence, and for the first time, I felt the unsettling certainty that I was not the only thing moving through it. The forest beyond the river was still. The air felt colder there, thinner, as though something had drained the warmth from it. My breath hung in front of me, short, uneven bursts, and the trees stood closer together, their bark darkened with moss that glimmered faintly when my lantern light caught it. I walked until I found a small clearing and set my pack down, my hands stiff from the cold. The ground was damp, the soil soft enough to leave shallow impressions when I knelt to start a fire. The smoke drifted low, curling back toward me instead of rising. and carried with it a faint metallic tang. The same scent I'd noticed, growing stronger since the second day. I tried not to dwell on it. The silence pressed in again, broken only by the occasional rustle of the underbrush, each one too brief to locate. The forest felt hollow, emptied of life, as if everything had once belonged here, had gone deeper underground. By the time the fire had settled into a low burn, the fog had begun to move through the trees. Thin, at first, then thick enough to swallow the trunks whole. I sat near the fire, rubbing warmth back into my fingers, and listened. It began with the same distant calls as before, fragmented sounds that could have been anything, a shout, an echo, or the bark of some unseen animal. Then another followed, closer this time. The rhythm was off, the tone hollow, as if someone were repeating words they did not understand. It went on for a while, stopping and starting, always changing direction. At one point, it imitated a sound I recognized, the coarse bleating of a goat. Though there shouldn't be any livestock this far out, it was faint, but not distant. The longer it went on, the more deliberate it seemed. Each pause waited, as if waiting for a reply. I fed another stick into the fire and forced myself to stay still. But my heartbeat had grown uneven, a pulse that filled the silence when the sound finally stopped. The woods didn't relax when it ended, they only seemed to listen harder. The last thing I remember was the soft crackle of ash and wind howling through the trees, carrying with it low, ominous echoes that rose and fell until sleep took me. I woke before dawn, though not by choice. The air had changed. A stench pressed through the cold, thick and rancid enough to pull me from my shallow sleep. It clung to my throat, rot and iron. The smell of something long dead, yet warm. For a moment, I thought the scent was in my dreams, until the wind shifted again and carried it stronger, rolling down from the mountain above like a tide of decay. The fire had burned to ash. My hand shook as I stirred the embers back to life, though I told myself it was from the cold. The odor grew heavier with each breath, souring in the air until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I tried to reason through it. Some carcass, perhaps, carried down by the current or left by wolves. But the scent was too sharp, too deliberate. It wasn't simply present, it was moving. I packed what I could and followed the smell. The sky was still black, the stars dimmed by a low drift of fog. My boots broke the frost beneath me, and every sound felt too loud. The cold had deepened, the kind that dulls the fingers and makes the world brittle. As I climbed, I began to hear the mimicry again. The first sound was faint, a bird's call, except the pitch bent oddly, a feathered rasp behind it. Then another, a man's groan, fractured and short, like someone remembering pain. Fear pressed close, but turning back felt worse. If I stopped now, I'd never know what waited behind those sounds. And ignorance felt the greater danger. So I kept moving toward what every instinct told me to avoid. The ground rose and flattened into a clearing ringed with roots and shale. The smell was strongest here, nearly visible in the air. Copper and rot, sweet in the way of infection. The soil looked churned, the earth soft and darkened with moisture. When I knelt, I saw bones, splintered and gnawed, tangled among matted feathers and gray tufts of hair. I brushed aside loose earth with my glove, uncovering fragments of hide, thin twigs, and something pale beneath. Eggshell, maybe, cracked and hollowed by time. I leaned closer. There was a pattern to it, circular, almost deliberate. Bones and branches woven into the shape of a nest. The sight didn't register at first. It was too strange, too wrong in its precision. Then I noticed the prints, deep, sharp divots in the soil, the marks of talons dragging through. That was when the ground moved. At first, it was so slight that I thought it might have been my imagination, a ripple through the soil, like breath stirring beneath the surface. Then it came again, heavier, a slow push that lifted the earth in uneven pulses. The sound followed, a dull grinding, soil sliding over bone. I backed away a step. The air turned thick and close. The nest shuddered once more, splitting along the middle as the packed dirt began to heave upward. Something was coming out. I stumbled back just as the soil split open. What rose from it was not fast at first. It unfolded, deliberate, in a smooth, predatory rhythm. The smell suddenly hit harder. Blood turned sour, feathers wet with decay. It was taller than me, thin, but wrong in proportion. Its limbs bent inward, the joints reversed in places they shouldn't be, and its skin stretched so tight I could see the twitch of muscle beneath translucent film. Ragged feathers clung to its shoulders, streaked with dark fluid, and missing in patches that revealed lesions and sores. Its head jerked upward, long beaked, sharp, the curve of it slick with rot. It made no sound at first. Then came the mimicry. Scattered at random, the cries of animals, the faint laughter of a child, and then a woman's voice, pleading for the life of her child, the words trembling apart mid sentence before collapsing into a shrill, guttural shriek that rattled through the clearing. It turned then, slow, deliberate, and I knew it had my scent. Its head cocked once, the beak twitching, and a slick hiss escaped it. I dropped behind the roots of the nearest tree, pressing into the soil, every breath held between heartbeats. Its talons scraped the earth, clicking softly as it searched. Through the gaps, I could see its chest rising and falling too fast, its skin pulsing faintly with every breath, as if veins beneath it were lit with fever. A sudden noise broke the tension. A bird bursting from the trees. The creature's head snapped toward it, eyes narrowing. It shrieked again, a deep, layered cry that shook loose frost from the branches above. I took the chance and ran. Branches clawed at me. The cold tore through my lungs. Behind me came the rhythm of pursuit, a fast, erratic pounding that hit the earth like distant thunder. I broke through the tree line and saw the river below, glinting under the moonlight. I didn't know if the water would save me or just delay the end, but I was out of choices, so I jumped. The water hit like stone. I sank, then surfaced, gasping, the cold biting so deep it hollowed the breath from me. The current dragged hard, pulling me downstream. Through the haze, I saw it standing at the bank, tall, motionless, the beak turning to follow me. It stepped once, then halted, lowering its head toward the water, as if gauging the depth. For a moment it stood there utterly still, fog drifting through its outline. Then it lifted its head and began to move along the bank. Slow, deliberate steps that matched my drift through the current. It didn't chase. It simply followed, its shape gliding between the trees as the river pulled me on. The current pulled harder the further I went, numbing my limbs until I couldn't tell where the water ended and I began. Each breath came sharp, shallow, and every time I lifted my head, I could still see it lingering along the bank. It moved along with a dreadful patience, keeping pace with me, waiting for the right opportunity. I was starting to lose consciousness. Time felt like it was slipping away from me. Just when I thought I'd slip under completely, a sound broke through the veil, faint at first, but familiar enough to pull me back awake. As I regained my senses and focused, I came to realize that it was the sound of a dog barking. I forced my head up just in time to see the creature freeze on the bank. Its entire frame went rigid, skin twitching in places where feathers had fallen away. Then it turned, beak lifted, scenting the air, and bolted into the trees in a sudden explosive burst of movement that sent leaves shivering in its wake. The moment it vanished, I clawed my way back towards the bank, dragging myself up through the mud and roots. My legs barely held me, and for a few seconds, I could only stand there, coughing river water, shivering, trying to steady my breath. I was barely standing, strained and shaking, but a barking dog meant that there were others out here besides myself, unaware of the danger, heading straight for them. I couldn't stay where I was. I had to try to reach them. I pushed myself into a staggered run, forcing my legs to move, branches slapping against my arms and face as I hurried in the direction the creature had gone. Only then did I shout, raw and ragged, "Run! It's coming! Run!" My voice barely carried. The dog barked again, closer now, and then abruptly choked off into a wet, clipped whimper. I knew what that meant. I pushed harder. When I reached the clearing, I nearly slipped in the blood before I understood what I was looking at. The creature was in the center of the camp. 3 tents were half collapsed. A pot lay overturned in the ashes of a small fire, its contents splattered across the dirt. A woman lay face down near the cart, her arms at unnatural angle. The dog, what remained of it, was strewn in 2 torn pieces beside her. A man was crawling backward on his elbows, kicking weakly at the dirt, as if trying to push the earth itself away from him. The creature was already on him. Up close, it was worse than what I'd imagined from its silhouette. Taller than any of us, gaunt but powerful, feathers hanging in diseased clumps from translucent skin that showed the twitching of tendons beneath. Pustules bulged at its joints. Its long beak, blackened and curved, was glossy with fresh blood. It struck downward. The sound was a thick, wet crunch as the bone punched through bone and lung. The man's scream bent into something thin and desperate before collapsing altogether as the creature tore free a mouthful of flesh, shaking its head until the sinew snapped. Blood sprayed in a wide arc across the dirt. Another shout tore through the clearing. A second merchant, trying to flee. He made 3 steps before the creature lunged, talons catching his shoulder and dragging him down like a sack of grain. Bones cracked beneath it. The creature raked its beak into his side, tearing him open in ragged, frantic motions, with no restraint. I stood rooted in place, powerless, while the clearing drowned in the sounds of tearing flesh and wet, panicked thrashing. Its breath came in rattling hisses, each exhale carrying that rot-heavy stench, iron and decay. The third man was still alive, dragging himself toward the tree line, leaving a long smear of red behind him. His eyes found mine, wide, pleading, shining with a terror that felt like it could swallow us both. I stepped forward once, instinctively. Too late. The sky shifted. A thin line of gold broke through the highest branches as dawn pushed against the forest canopy, streaking pale light over the scene. It didn't burn the creature, didn't even slow it. But it noticed, head tilting, eyes unfocused, as if the brightness irritated it. It clicked its beak with a sharp metallic sound, then turned back to the crawling man. Before I could take another step, it seized him by the torso and began to burrow. Fast, violently fast. Its talons tore into the soil, flinging dirt behind it in churning bursts. The ground caved around the man's writhing body as he was dragged down, screaming until the earth reached his ribs, then his throat, then his mouth. His hand broke the surface one last time, fingers stretching toward me, trembling, empty. The ground swallowed them both. The last sound, a muffled howl beneath the soil, before it collapsed inward and went still. The forest did not feel any lighter once the creature vanished. If anything, the silence pressed harder, as though the woods themselves were holding the memory of what had happened. I forced myself to move, though each step felt separate from intention, slow, steady, as my thoughts began to settle. Before leaving the clearing, I searched through what remained of the camp, carefully, almost numbly, working slowly to avoid damaging anything. I did my best not to disturb the bodies. The blood beneath them had already started to pool and congeal as the frigid air began to settle in. I tried not to linger on any one form for long. The sight, already burned into me, was enough. I focused instead on what they had carried. The woman's cart held several sealed crates, dried provisions, salt, tools, and folded fabrics wrapped in waxed paper. Beneath the seat, half shielded by a blanket, I found a ledger listing their cargo, supplies meant for the valley town, winter stock, ordered and paid for. They hadn't been passing through, they had been returning, bringing back what the town needed to survive the cold months. As I checked the remaining belongings, I found more. Two small lockboxes, heavy with coin, and a ledger listing the profits from the village's wool, hides, and timber. Enough to see the townsfolk through the winter. Now it all lay scattered in the mud. It dawned on me that I needed to let someone know. Despite the tragedy, the villagers might at least recover some of their much needed supplies. A faint ringing filled my ears, and for a moment I wasn't sure if it was the cold or shock. My thoughts felt thick, sluggish. I knew I needed to leave before the creature returned, but the weight of what I had found held me still longer than it should have. When I finally stepped back, I realized my hands were shaking. At first, I thought it was shock, but the cold was tightening in the air, sharp enough to sting my knuckles. My coat was soaked from the river, and the chill was seeping straight through me. I couldn't stay out here, not without fire or shelter, not another night. The villagers needed warning, and what remained of their supplies wouldn't last long out here. Before leaving the clearing, I rifled through what remained of the merchant's supplies one last time. Beneath a crate of salted meat, I found a heavy winter coat, wool-lined, oil-treated. Tucked beneath the cart seat was a pair of dry leather boots, insulated and a size too large, but far better than the soaked, freezing ones on my feet. I replaced them quickly. A traveling lantern lay on its side near the fire pit, its glass unbroken. I lit it and let its warmth settle back into my hands. The cold left no room for hesitation. I kept moving, one foot after the other, driven by the simple resolve that I needed to reach the village before nightfall. With every crunching step, I was reminded of the horror I'd witnessed that day. Those merchants had families waiting for them, people who would never see them return. And whatever had killed them hadn't simply taken their lives, it had devoured them without thought, without pause. My thoughts drifted, despite myself. The creature's origins, its nature, how something like it could exist at all. Each question hung over me like a shroud, but surviving the walk back came first. There would be time to ponder that later. At the moment, I could only focus on staying upright, staying warm, staying alive. By the time the roofs of the town finally came into view between the trees, the light had thinned to a dull, wintry gray. My legs ached from the constant climb and descent, and each breath stung as it left my lungs. But the sight of the chimneys and shuttered windows, warm light gathering behind them, was enough to pull me the last stretch. I warily made my way back to my lodging, each step heavier than the last. Once inside, I took off the coat and boots I'd taken from the merchant's cart and set them near the room's small stove to chase off the lingering chill. The guilt of it lingered, but necessity dulled the edge. Better their belongings see use than freeze beside their owners. Without them, I wouldn't have lasted the day. I changed out of my damp clothes and into what dry garments I had left, then sat down to begin cataloging the events I had witnessed. When my hands finally steadied, I lit the lamp and sat at the narrow desk by the window. If I didn't commit the memories to the page while they were still sharp, they would warp into nightmares by morning. I wrote until the words began to tilt and blur, and somewhere between one sentence and the next, exhaustion pulled me under, leaving the pen falling still against a half-written thought. I woke late, my body stiff and sore in ways I hadn't noticed the night before. For a while, I just sat on the edge of the bed, letting my thoughts settle. Once my thoughts were steady, I composed a brief notice for the Reeve. The location of the clearing, the condition of the camp, the remaining goods and coin. I omitted everything else. I signed nothing. In a town this frightened, any attempt to explain what I had seen would only raise accusations, and they'd fall squarely on the outsider who returned alone. An anonymous warning was the most reasonable course. I folded the note twice, tucked it into my coat, and waited until the central street had grown quiet. The Reeves' office sat near the mill. Its windows shuddered against the cold. I approached only when no one lingered nearby, slid the folded message beneath the door, and left without looking back. Back in my room, I returned to my notes. The more I tried to set the events in order, the more questions rose between the lines. I wrote until the page felt crowded with them. How a thing like that could exist, what shaped it, what sustained it, and how long it had stalked these valleys unnoticed. None of the old records had ever spoken plainly about creatures like this. Only hints, only warnings, and I began to realize why. These were the truths the Order had cautioned me against, the ones they said led men away from reason, into obsession, into ruin. They had exiled me for chasing shadows, but now I had stood within arm's reach of one. No theory could dismiss what I had seen. No doctrine could turn me back from it now. I found myself staring at the unfinished page, at the ink drying in uneven strokes. Whatever the Blight Claw was, however it came to be, it was no isolated terror. It was a thread in something larger, older, and far less forgiving than any archive had ever dared describe. And now that I had come this close, I knew I couldn't stop. Not anymore. The tavern looked no different than I had expected. Warped beams, smoky lamplight, and the low murmur of voices trying a little too hard to sound untroubled. When I stepped through the door, the warmth hit me first, then a flicker of silence as the crowd turned their eyes toward the newcomer. I chose a corner seat, my back to the wall, letting the noise settle around me. It felt strange to sit among people again after the past 2 days. Stranger still, to pretend the normalcy while the memory of the clearing still pulsed behind my eyes. Near the center of the room, a young man was speaking loudly, breathless, and shaking with conviction, insisting he had seen something moving through the tree line at dusk. His hands trembled as he described a shape slipping between the trees, a sound that didn't belong to any living thing, and a smell drifting with it, sharp and rotten, like something long dead had stirred. The others laughed at him. They told him fear could turn a branch into a creature if he squinted hard enough. They told him to drink and forget. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct them. What good would it do? Even if I stood and told them everything, they would meet me with the same ridicule they gave him. And worse, the distrust reserved for a stranger. Outside, winter was beginning its slow crawl down from the peaks. I'd heard of a larger town to the north, one renowned for its winter festivities, a place where the turning of the season was marked with lanterns, music, and noise meant to chase away the dark. But a myth clung to that town as well, a colder one. And after what I had seen in the woods, I could no longer afford to treat such stories as superstition. Whatever I had encountered was not the whole of it. It was only the threshold. A single creature belonging to a truth the Order had long warned its scholars never to pursue. A truth far older and far wider than this valley. I finished the last of my drink and rose. Tomorrow, I would head north. There would be time enough to chase the truth and the mysteries behind it. But for tonight, I needed a moment to breathe